I'm Heba, Shahaed, interviewing John McIntyre today, January 31st, 2015. Hi, John.
Hello.
So, how long have you been in Aurora for?
Well, I've lived here all my life, or at least all my life so far, except for times when I was away at university and at graduate school, and so really most of my life.
Wow, so what is your involvement with the Historical Society?
Well, currently I'm president of the Historical Society, but I've been involved. Um, well, I guess since at least the late 1960s. I remember doing an exhibit in I think it was 1968 or 1969 for the Historical Society in a storefront in the center of Aurora, and I became a member of the board at that time too, and was involved in the organization of the very first Aurora Museum in the old Aurora Waterworks building, which
Oh,
opened
wow.
back in 1973, and that was the start of the museum. And then I served as volunteer curator along with Don Webster, who was a cousin of mine. And so the when the museum began, I was very much involved in that. And then in the move to the Church Street School, which is now the Cultural Center, that's where the museum was, and we moved there in 1981. And then the Historical Society acquired Hillary House in 1981, and I was part of that too. And I'm not sure where Idolo is is going to go, but anyway, here he is. And so I guess all along I've been involved in the Historical Society in one way or the other.
Wow, so what do you think has been the number one thing that you've done for the Aurora Historical Society that's the most memorable for you?
Um, well, I think it was certainly the work with the collection to establish or help establish the collection in the early years and have a home for it. As I say, first of all, in the old Aurora Waterworks building where Park Place Manor is today, actually. And then I was very much part of the crusade to save the Church Street School from demolition and to move the museum there, and worked with local officials like John West, who was a councillor at that time and later mayor. He was very much involved in that campaign. And so the successful moving of the museum to the Cultural Center in 1981, and then the acquisition of Hillary House in 1981, because that house could have been demolished, it could have been lost to the community if the Historical Society hadn't stepped forward at that time. So I think those would be probably the most important things that I've been involved with. And then since that time, trying to do what I can to make sure that the museum is successful and that that Hillary House National Historic Site is successful.
What do you plan to do in the future for the Historical Society?
Well, of course, the Historical Society is changing and evolving. The town of Aurora now looks after the museum, and so
Right.
the Hillary House, or so the Historical Society is focused on Hillary House. But I hope that still it will be the Aurora Historical Society that will be
Right.
concerned about all the history of Aurora, not just of Hillary House. And it's a real challenge for a relatively small organization to own a property like Hillary House, to maintain it properly, to operate it as a museum, and fewer and fewer organizations are doing that now. I mean, it's by and large government agencies that run museums. So I hope over the next few years we'll be able to strengthen the Historical Society's fundraising and its resources so that it can be a very good steward of Aurora's history.
Now, I know that you've been living here for almost all your life. So, what school did you go to?
Well, started out at the Well Street School, which is now being turned into condominiums, actually.
Oh,
That was where I started kindergarten and part of grade one. And then when I was about halfway through grade one, George Street School was ready. So I moved over to George Street School. And I remember that first day when first classes were there, and it seemed like such a wonderful modern new school. And of course now, here we are in 2015, and I hear that George Street School is going to be closing fairly soon also.
Oh, wow.
So I was there, and then George Street went up only to grade 7 at that time, so I went back to Wells Street for grade 8, and then to Williams for high school.
That sounds like fun. So many schools.
Well, it's sort of back and forth from Wells Street to George Street and back again to Wells Street. But
what did you enjoy doing as a child? Like, did you have any favorite places to go? Something you enjoyed doing?
Well, I think at that time, just going a few blocks seemed like a big adventure. I mean, as you say, I've lived in the same place for a good part of my life, which is right here on Yonge Street at the corner of Yonge and Irwin. And a lot of my friends lived on Irwin Avenue, which is the street just to the south of my house. And beyond Irwin Avenue to the west, there is a creek, and beyond the creek is what is now Fleury Park. But when I was growing up, going across the creek was a huge adventure. If we were going across the creek, it assumed that we'd be sort of packing a lunch and going over there, and it would be like going into this wilderness, this very exciting place. And now I look at it, and it's really only about 2 or 3 blocks away. But then it was an adventure because the park hadn't been opened up yet, and so when you crossed the creek, there wasn't a bridge, so you'd be crossing on stones and that sort of thing. And it was an adventure. But sometimes we think of those times as idyllic. But I remember we would look at the fish that were in that creek, and the fish often had these really grotesque growths on them, these tumors really, and that was because of the tannery in Aurora, which was one of the big industries. And of course that building has just been torn down early in this year, 2015, and it provided work for a lot of people, including the father of one of my best friends. But it would regularly discharge all sorts of chemicals into the water and presumably in the ground as well. And we didn't know at that time. We thought it was funny if the creek turned blue, or if the creek turned this strange color green. But it was all the chemicals in it. And then we saw the fish, and we just thought it was really strange, and didn't realize what was really happening. Certainly, we're a lot more aware of pollution now. So in a way, it sort of sounds idyllic and very rural, but even at that time, there were some problems.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, what other big industries were in Aurora at the time?
Well, during my childhood, I remember when Sterling Drug arrived in Aurora. That was the biggest industry at Yonge Street and Murray Drive, where the Canadian Tire store is now. But Sterling Drug made Bayer aspirin and Phillips milk of magnesia. There were all these big name medicines that came out of Sterling Drug, and so that was the big new industry of my childhood. And when people looked at that building, we thought, oh, that's going to be here forever. And yes, that's one of the many things that has changed dramatically, because it turned out they were here for maybe 25 years or something like that, and that was a good long time, and a lot of people found employment there. But then they closed, and I think moved back to the United States, because they had been an American company to start with. Mm-hmm. And so that was a big thing when they arrived in town, because they were the biggest industry by far. But then when they left the town later, it was another big thing for the community. Difficult time.
Right. So you've been living in this house for a large portion of your life,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So how has this house kind of changed or grown with you? Do you have any special memories? Well,
it was built in 1875, and then my grandparents bought the house in 1901. So they were the second family to own the house. So As of this year, it's been in my family for 114 years. So my grandparents bought it, and they had both looked at this house and wanted to buy it for quite a while before they actually did. And they rented a house about a block away when they were married in 1899. And they rented that house partly so that they could keep an eye on this one, so that if it came up for sale or if they heard anything about it coming up for sale, they would be the first people to put in an offer on it. And so that's what they did. About 2 years after they moved into their rented house, Mrs. Robinson, who at that time was the widow of Dr. Robinson, who built the house, had put the house up for sale. And so they purchased it, and it was a big decision because they were not wealthy by any means, but they furnished the house with what to them was used furniture, and then today people look at that as antiques, but then they were buying used furniture just to fill the house. And so they lived here, and they raised 2 daughters here, one of them being my mother, Margaret Webster. And then when my mother married William McIntyre in 1950, they decided that they would continue to live here. And so then I was born here. My sister was born here. And so as I say, I grew up here, went away to university, lived elsewhere for a while. I think Idolo's going to go down now. and then ultimately came back. And so it hasn't changed all that much. I mean, a lot of other houses were being modernized over the years, and certainly changes were made over time, but not a lot of major changes were done. Right. I think it was always because the house was so big, probably nobody could afford to make big changes and big modernizations, which is good today because I think people value history a little bit more and tradition a little bit more. So it hasn't changed that much at all.
This house is in such great condition too.
Well, it seems to be, for the most part, yes.
Have you had like any special memories in this house?
Well, I mean, all the memories of of growing up. I mean, when I was growing up, my grandmother was still living, and she passed away in 1964, and actually I remember when she was interviewed by the Historical Society. And so somewhere and somewhere there is a tape of my grandmother being interviewed, and she, I think, shaped a lot of my interest in history because I grew up asking her about what was life like in the olden days, as I thought of them. She'd been born in 1875, and so in a way that means that when I think back, I can, in a way, picture a little bit of what life would have been like, well over, what's that, 130 years ago, 135 years ago, because she would talk about growing up in this community, because she grew up here, and her family had lived here for several generations. I mean, today Aurora has preserved the Petch log house, which is near the town hall, and some of my ancestors actually built that house. So wow. They were among the pioneers, and my grandmother had a sense of history and the importance of history, and liked to talk about the olden days. And so she sparked my interest in history.
So does that house still exist over there?
The Petch log house?
The Petch log
house? Yeah, it was originally located where the Best Buy store is now on the hill near 404 in Wellington. And when that development was created, the town made a deal with the developers that the house would be dismantled, or at least it would be moved. Right. And the developers provided some money for the restoration. And it took a number of years, actually, before the town decided what they wanted to do with it. And still in 2015, they're deciding what they're going to do with it in the future. But then they rebuilt it next to the town hall.
And is that also kind of like the Hillary House, like containing lots of...
It's empty actually right now, and so it again its future use is still something the town's considering now. But what it does do is it shows the some of the traditional construction methods, and also the massive size of timber that was here, that was cut and then used in constructing log buildings.
Wow. Mm-hmm. So in 2003, I believe you were the Aurora Citizen of the Year.
That's right.
So would you like to tell us about that?
Well, it was it was a complete surprise. I mean, it was a great honor, and I didn't know anything about it. A friend of mine asked me if I would go out for dinner that evening, and I forget how it exactly worked out, but then I found that we weren't really going to dinner, that she was taking me over to the town hall, and then it all sort of happened over there. So I was certainly surprised, and it was certainly an honor, because there have been a lot of people who've contributed a lot over time to the community, and so it was both an honor and a surprise.
So why do you believe that you were nominated?
Well, I think it was largely my work with the museum and with the preservation of Hillary House. And then I had written a book called Aurora, A History in Pictures. And I did that to make sure that some of the pictures which the Historical Society gathered together would have a wider audience. And so that came out in 1988, and then there was a reprinting of that, thanks to Ron Wallace here in Aurora, about 10 years after that. And now that's out of print, but there's still people who ask about it, and of course people who refer to it because it's still available through the library and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so like what does it talk about, like everything that's happened in Aurora?
Well, it's based on historic photographs, and also some maps and some plans. So the earliest the earliest of the maps go back to the 1850s, and then the latest of the pictures would come up to about the time of World War II. So, I mean, if you just provide people with a book of words, then some will be interested in reading the book and so on. But I thought that having a book that was primarily of pictures with some interesting captions and stories, that would capture more people's imagination, and that it would be of more interest to young people who might not want to just read through page after page of words, but might be inspired by the pictures and might ask questions when they saw the pictures, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so like while doing research, collecting the photographs, how do you feel Aurora has changed over the years?
Well, I mean, certainly, as everyone says, it's so much bigger. But I remember when I was growing up, the time of Aurora's centennial in 1963. That was the time when Aurora's population first hit 10,000 people, and people felt that was a huge change, because in a very short period of time, and really, I think really less than 10 years. Aurora had grown from only about 3,500 up to 10,000. So, in a way, that's 300% in less than 10 years. So, we have grown a lot more in the last 40 years, but it's actually been slower than what happened in the 50s and early 60s. I mean, that was an explosive growth at that time. And I remember in 1963, people were saying, how can you... There were three parts to the town. There was the old part of the town, and then to the north was Aurora Heights, and to the south was Regency Acres. And the big discussion was then, that all these new people, how are you going to integrate them? But now today, people think of that as part of the older part of town. And so how do you then integrate people who are living east of Bayview, for instance? And so it's a process that I think the town's been dealing with for a long time. I mean, how do you make people who haven't lived in the community for a long time, how do you make them feel as if this is their home? And so it's it can be a challenge now as it was a challenge then, but I don't think it's anything that's completely new to Aurora. I think probably the biggest challenge to Aurora's identity now is more the proximity to Toronto, and so many people work outside of Aurora, so they may not identify with the community as much today as people who would not only live here, but they would work here and they would do all their shopping here and that sort of thing. And now you may go elsewhere for all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. So, I know you talked about like many changes in Aurora and lots of things that have happened. Is there anything memorable that you experienced over here?
Well, I mean, I guess there are a lot of things. I mean, when I was growing up, I mean, I remember Aurora's centennial year, '63. That was a really seemed to be a big event, a really exciting event. So I mean, that's something I remember from childhood. I mean, there were the things that happened annually that were big. And when I was growing up, the 24th of May, Victoria Day weekend, was actually bigger in Aurora than the 1st of July. And so I remember going over to the town park, and that's where the fireworks would be, right in the center of the old part of town, at Wells Street. And the Lions Club always had a small midway and rides and that sort of thing. So that was always something that was really exciting, that said that, you know, summer can't be too far away. And so Victoria Day, the 24th of May weekend, was a really big event in town. And then the horse show for years. I mean, that was a big event. And that happened also at the town park on Wells Street. Eventually it was moved over to Machel Park. But I mean, the horse show was a big annual event. And then as time went on, the 1st of July became more of a focus for the community. So those were things that happened every year. You know, certainly other memorable events was the opening of the museum back in 1973, and then moving the museum and the big school reunion that was held in 1981 at Church Street School, and the opening of the purchasing of Hillary House by the Historical Society in 1981. I mean, that was another big thing. I mean, more recently, and probably a lot of people will be thinking of this. I mean, the terrible fire at the Aurora United Church. I think anyone who was in Aurora and knew Aurora for a long time, was, whether they went to that church or not, I think was deeply affected by the fire that destroyed that church.
Right. So I know you talked about the horse show.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ride horses?
No, I didn't. No, and I just admired horses, and it was just something that if you lived in Aurora, you always went to it.
And I think that show doesn't happen anymore.
No, sadly, it hasn't, and I guess that's been because the community's changed from the area has changed. Really,
Right.
It's not an agricultural area the way it once was, and so that's now gone. But for many years, that was really the big event of every year. Whether I think when I was a kid growing up, it was more the going on the Ferris wheel and that sort of thing, rather than spending much time watching the horses, quite frankly. But that's what the event was focusing on for the adults, anyway.
So is there anything else that you would like to talk about, anything about Aurora which you'd like to mention? Or your experience?
Well, I guess only to go back to something I was saying before, that people talk about, the community is changing. Mm-hmm. And yes, it is. But as I say, I think there were as many changes that were quite large and quite important in the past, just as there are changes now. And, sometimes people become very nostalgic about the small town that was, and it's not a small town anymore, and that sort of thing. But I think while certain things pass away, other other good things may happen to replace them. And I think Aurora is still a very good place for people to live. Their experience will be different, but it's it's still a very good place, and I think a very exciting place to be.
Right. So like changing for the better.
I think so. Yeah.
But what do you think our future holds? Like, what do you think might happen?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, if Aurora continues to grow as it has been, and Newmarket continues to grow as it has been, and the GTA continues to grow as it has been, then maybe the identities of the separate communities will be all sort of folded into one another. I mean, there was talk a few years ago of amalgamation, that there wouldn't be an Aurora anymore. There wouldn't be an Aurora council or a self-governing municipality that would be a much bigger municipality, maybe combined with Newmarket, for instance. And I mean, it's hard to say what may happen over the next years. Whether people think that bigger is better, or maybe smaller is better too. So, that's certainly a possibility over time, and I think that's why having a place like Hillary House and having the Aurora Museum collection and taped interviews like this and photographic collections the way Aurora has and so on, I think that's important, because even if there are those political changes, you still have that evidence of how a community grew and how people lived and how people faced problems in the past and overcame those problems, and the successes people had and the challenges people had, and so that record, I hope, will continue.
I hope so too. And I believe all your work is inspired by your grandmother, who you were talking about earlier, or is there someone else?
Well, I mean, she was. Certainly my parents as well, and others in my family. But I think the fact that she lived here, and that she, as I say, that her memory went back into the 1870s, and that she talked about her family roots even before that. That was always one of the biggest influences, anyway.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you would like to mention?
Probably as soon as we stop the interview, there'll be all sorts of things. But offhand, I can't think of anything else at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview with us. And
well, thank you.